Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another one of our webinars. This morning, Howard is going to be talking about regulation standards in the NHS. Let me introduce our host for today, Rachel Slawson. I'm going to hand over to Rachel now and be in the background for any questions. Welcome, Rachel. Good morning.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing really well on this Friday morning with lots of things going on in the world, but don't worry. We're going to have an awesome presentation for you by Howard Scott. And so if you have any questions during the presentation, if you just pop them in the chat and then I will ask Howard at the end or any appropriate moment I can maybe edge into the presentation. But yeah, if you do that, that'd be really awesome. You'll all be on mute because Howard's got a lot to say. But yeah, if you could pop your questions in there. Oh, hello. Sunny Cheshire, people are coming in from sunny Wales. Oh, I like it. Yeah, so if you just pop your questions in the chat panel, and then I can bring it up with Howard at the end. And I really hope you enjoy it, and we will make sure there's a copy of the slides available for you. And we will also send out a questionnaire at the end. And we are recording this, but on the screen it will only show Howard or whoever's speaking. All right, okay. Well, I hope you enjoy it, and I'm handing over to Howard.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully we'll get the screen on and everyone will be able to see this. This morning's session is not the one that always people move towards with enthusiasm when we talk about regulation and standards. However, I think it's important that people just understand really the landscape that's out there, that we, if you're working in and around the NHS, you understand sort of the landscape that's out there, why we've got a variety of these standards in place. I'm going to cover off, as you can see there, a little bit of what an act, a regulation and standards are. And hopefully at the end of this, we'll have that greater understanding of the landscape. Clear perspective of what different organisations do and their roles there. And finally, I'll give you a really good place to go, just so you can, if you, as I say, in or around healthcare within the NHS, where you can go and actually look at perhaps where which act is relevant to which regulation, which might impact on your particular service as well. Okay, moving on to the next slide. We'll kick off with regulation. So here you can see, it is very much it's a dictionary definition that you've got there. The act of regulating, so that's people who are doing it, and the state of being regulated. So it's talking about an authoritative rule, but I think the one that probably best fits is a rule or order issued by an executive authority. So that's the British government or regulatory agency of government, and having the force of law. So when we're talking about regulation, just remember this: it is law. So this is not best practice or law. You would hope most regulations are based upon best practice, but it is definitely by law. And I'll explain how that works on the next slide. So if you kind of, it's this kind of hierarchy here. So an act is, I suppose, an act of parliament really creates a new law or changes an existing law. And it starts off as a bill, and it then goes through and is agreed and approved by the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And at that point, then really it's moving into an act. Now, when this is an act, it then, in order to, if you want to provide greater detail to what that act means, there's then a whole range of regulations, rules and codes. And that's because your act is your primary legislation, and then you've got a subsidiary legislation, and they get published. Not that I would recommend it's the greatest read ever, but it's almost like daily. It's called the Government Gazette, or the London Gazette, it's sometimes referred to. And this is when things actually become legal, and you can see what the regulations are. So I've given you some examples there of an act, the Health and Social Care Act in 2012. But also you've got, so there's, I thought I'd put in something quite contemporary there, that you've got recently with COVID, there's been a new legislation really laid before Parliament in terms of this, and you can see that this is very much providing greater detail under the Act, which is the Public Health Act of 1984, and it relates to how the government's now going to manage COVID and extra powers that they've got. So if you can get clear in your mind that you've got the Act, that's the first thing, and then what comes after that is the detail. So it's, as I say, it's guidelines. It's how that Act is going to happen in if you want, day-to-day life, and how the regulators are going to enforce some of the things that they can do, and what's expected of people if they're actually providing services under which the regulations apply. So there's a little, as I say, a little bit of background, so at least you understand when we talk about acts and regulations, how they connect in and where, if you want, they're empowered from. And it is, as I say, the regulation definitely are linked it up through there to acts which have been passed and are now law. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background here. There's 90 regulators up in the UK, not all in healthcare, and they cover, as you can see, a wide variety of areas: education, healthcare, charities, transport, communication, media, utilities, and environment. So, you know, some of this is sort of like Ofcom and the like. There's an awful lot of them, and certainly here in England, currently, although there's been an awful lot of work working through this following, shall we say, the UK departure from a lot of European arrangements. 34 regulatory agencies which very much affect the UK as well. Across UK, we're generally spending about 4 billion on regulators, which is quite a significant amount. There is and there are plans in place to try and reduce that figure by the government. But it's just to let you know that regulation is big business really across the UK. But in terms of focus, today we're going to look at healthcare regulation and standards. So we'll move on to that slide. This is a really good slide that was published in the BMJ in 2019, and it's one that I like to use because it kind of sets out in, I think, a very easy to understand really chart where you've got statutory regulators. And so when we talk about regulators, just keep in mind, so these are regulations backed by law. So you've got a variety there of service professional and a national commissioning group, which is sort of like NHS England, where NHS England fit into this. But then you've got organisations with regulatory influence, and there's a whole range of those. And I'll go through later on and give you some examples of what these kind of groups look like and how they operate. But if you look at NHS Trust, it's caught there in the middle, and sometimes understanding what statutory regulations apply to you, and then you've got all those other professional associations and peer review groups there, and Royal Colleges, all publishing guidance. It can be actually quite a difficult place to understand what's applicable to you, how you should be managing sort of your awareness of all these regulations and best practice, as they all, if you want, all seem to come to you if you're sitting within a trust or another sort of healthcare provider environment. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. So, as I said before, there's 3 types of healthcare regulator, and they tend to be grouped in terms of service regulation, professional regulation, and one national commissioning regulator. So I'll go through each of those in terms of just what each of those areas involve. So next slide, please. If you look at the service regulators, you'll see there's quite a lot. A lot of those, hopefully, you'll recognise. Most people are familiar with the National sort of the Care Quality Commission, CQC. But then there's NHS Improvement. You've got the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. If you're not familiar, effectively, this is a sort of the government regulatory function. And they actually go in and review the competence of organisations that provide certification, testing, inspection, and calibration. So it's quite a wide ranging particular regulator is at UCAS. Obviously, you've got the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, Health and Safety Executive and Environment Agency. NHS Resolution, that was, in terms of, that used to be, if you want, the NHSLA, sort of NHS Litigation Authority, and I think you rebranded at least 5-6 years ago now, so it's now NHS Resolution. You've got the Coroner Society of England and Wales. Not many people have heard of that particular one. Human Tissues Authority, and then the Medicines Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, which the clue's in the title. Obviously, it's looking at healthcare products and medicines and how that they are produced and distributed and stored and things. So there's quite a lot of service regulators out there, which you just need to be cognizant really of, that they're out there and they have a very strong role in managing regulation. And I'll come on to in terms of what some of their oversight roles are later on. So next slide, please. Professional regulators, awful lot of ones beginning with general, but you've got the Medical Council, Dental Council. Well, you can go through all of those. There's an awful lot of them in there. Health and Care Professionals Council and Nurse and Midwifery Council. So again, these are professional organisations that have a role in regulating the people that work within their particular, if you want, sphere. Obviously, medics, nurses, and you've got pharmaceutical professionals as well. So very much concerned with the standards and regulations for their particular professional group. And the last slide in terms of, if you want those regulatory things, and it's a very busy slide is this, but again, NHS England was established in about 2013, but that was following an Act of Parliament being passed. And for those of you who've not really got a great understanding about NHS England, it's a sort of executive non-departmental public body, and it oversees the Commission of Healthcare in England. It does lots of other things as well, and it's about setting up in terms of improving the country's health through a variety of things. But effectively, the Department of Health and Social Care entrusts NHS England with pretty much all the funding for England, and they then, through 135 clinical commissioning groups, commission the care and organisations that a lot of us have worked within in terms of that you expect in terms of acute hospitals, community hospitals, mental health hospitals and trusts there, plus all sorts of other stuff in terms of GP services that you would normally expect, say, voluntary agent, social enterprises and private companies. There's a whole range of organisations that through the NHS England and then the commissioning groups do that. The other thing is, as part of the regulatory element of commissioning, is as required by law, back to the Act again, the NHS England carries out an annual assessment of CCGs. And again, it's very much, for those of you that work in hospital trusts, it's not too dissimilar from sort of like a process where the CQC would come in. So yeah, they get looked at, and also one of the things when they're assessing them is not just about how well the money, the finances and the capacity and capability of the leadership, but you've also got then, they look at how well they're engaging and leading sort of the work across the STPs and the partnerships for their patch and trying to improve the outcomes of their patients. So if you want, just remember you've got the service regulators, you've got the professional regulators, and then what we've got here is this is the sort of regulatory environment in which commissioning happens as well. So moving on to the next slide, please. So I think it's important in terms of having looked at those areas there, the service and professional and national group, that we can step through a little bit more detail now. So if you'll bear with me, we'll go in a little bit more detail and a little bit of background as well. Next slide, please. So if we're looking organisations with regulatory influence, you'll see there's an awful lot of them out there. Now, when we talked about regulation, there was, as I say, it was quite easy to just look at the field there. But if you actually get into the bodies that sit underneath that slide that we had up there with the trust, where these are organisations which might influence or are looking to get their best practice or standards included within regulation, or at least take them very seriously. So if the regulators do come in, they may well ask about, are you delivering, or are you meeting perhaps the best guidance as laid out by I'm just not Royal College of Surgeons in terms of that particular thing. So if you look there, there's an awful lot of these groups. Now I'll just step through over the next like 5-10 minutes, just give you some examples where you just pick up so you can understand what you've got. So you've got, say, information standards there. There's 11 of them. There's a professional peer review and quality improvement, 13, advisory groups, 21, Royal College, 19. And then if you look at professional associations, now on that slide, as I say, there's 45. I think there's actually quite a lot more, but let's get into information and standards. So just two here that people might be familiar with. So included within this area, you've got NICE. Most people will be familiar with what NICE do in terms of providing national guidance and advice, and it's evidence-based recommendations, and they consult with a number of experts in the field, and then they, as it says there, consult with stakeholders and quality standards. You'll be very familiar, as I say, that NICE will produce this guidance, and whilst it is not a regulatory standard, a lot of provider organisations, their expectation will be that they are actually compliant with NICE recommendations, or at least they have a process in place by which when NICE recommendations come into the organisation, they've got a process where they can take that on board, they look at it, they do some sort of assessment of that, and they also do an assessment of whether or not they're compliant or not. And if not, the general view is that they will move to a position of compliance against those NICE guidelines. And so NICE is a really good example about something about not being technically a regulation, or if you want, but it's very much they develop the guidance by which most organisations are expected to be compliant with. Another part of, in terms of the information and standards, is the NCE pod organisation, and for those of you that work in the world of governance, you'll be very familiar with this particular organisation. But again, what they do is they obviously try to improve the standards of care for adults and children. But what they're really doing is collecting an awful lot of information. They undertake a lot of confidential surveys and research, and they publish an awful lot of this activity. So organisations can then, in terms of looking at this, see if whether or not they're an outlier in terms of a lot of the activity or a lot of the service and research that they do, or whether or not, they're very much sort of like middle of the sort of performance in relation to this. So you've got two very important groups there of 11, and I'm not going to go through every one, but just to give you some sort of understanding of what kind of sits within these groupings. Move on to the next slide. You've got professional peer review and quality improvement. So again, just a couple here from the wider list of 13. So these often you may well invite these organisations in to your services, and they will come in and as I said, including the title there with peer review and quality improvement. So they've got to come. So if you've got health care safety investigation branch, they're doing independent investigations about patient safety concerns. So sometimes they'll spot something about the activity in your particular organisation, and they may well contact you and say, we need to come in and just have a look at this. We need to understand your data a little bit more. So they may well come there. And again, if people have worked in governance, sometimes they may well have had discussions with the healthcare safety investigation branch. Also, you've got National Cancer Peer Review, again, quality assurance programme, and it supports a lot of cancer services. Sometimes it's a self-review, or they can do external like peer reviews coming in, and they will look at how your particular service meets with the agreed sort of nationally agreed quality measures, standards, and some of that might be about NICE guidance as well that we talked about earlier. So there's just a couple of examples of organisations that operate within that professional peer review and quality improvement area. Next slide. Thank you. Advisory groups. Yeah, there's an awful lot of advisory groups, 21. You'll see there, obviously, confidential advisory group. And a lot of these are quite independent. Some are established, as I say, with a little bit more government support, but very much you get into independent group that will look in, provide advice to, on this particular one, the Health Research Authority, who will then pull that wider together to see if there's any themes going across the NHS. JAG is, as you see, it's about GI endoscopy, but a lot of the time these are professional advisory groups that are pulled together because there's a general need in that profession for people to actually start to look at what's been happening, get some time a grip about the training, accreditation of services. So a lot of these come from within individual professional groups. So yeah, a couple there. Moving on to the next slide. Royal colleges, most of you will be very familiar. 19, I've just picked one really, just so you can see. And there's 19, and all of them are doing very similar things. So it's not just about there's one set of standards for what, you know, for the Royal College of Surgeons or the Royal College of GPs, something like that. Each of them will be developing like their service standards. So obviously, if you're looking at Royal College of Surgeons, they've got service standards for those areas there: surgical care team, cosmetic surgery, emergency surgery, major trauma, and children's surgery. But then they also have got a number of guides in things like service improvement, teamwork, and leadership. But then they've also got other areas where they will be, publishing stuff on knowledge, expectations, skills, performance, safety and quality, communication, partnership, and teamworking. So there's an awful lot. And if you think there's 19 Royal Colleges, all at various times publishing their own, if you want, standards or practice guides, with the view that this is based on best practice and it's within your own profession. If you're working within the NHS, that you and your trust should be ideally meeting, or at least working towards meeting, as well as all the regulatory activity which is sitting above you. It just gives you a picture of just about how busy this is. Move on to the next slide. So you've got the professional associations now, and there's an awful lot of them. You've got Social Paediatric Surgeons, Critical Care Society, Congenital Cardiac Association, British Geriatric Society. Awful, again, and these are an awful lot of groups, 45 in total. As I say, I've just picked 4 there, but just to give you some sort of feeling for the groups that we've got within this particular area. Again, these professional associations that from time to time will come together and will be trying to influence the regulatory frameworks and what is considered best practice. So there's an awful lot of organisations out there, which I would kind of sit within those, if you want that wider umbrella of just influencing and trying to change a lot of the regulation and standards that are out there. So yes, apologies for all that detail, but just to really give you some examples of what's kind of out there. Next slide, please, Rachel. So it's 127 organisations at the last count, which was about last year. So you've got those service regulators and professional regulators sitting up there, and then you've got all those there. That is a very busy slide when you see them all together. And if you're working within the NHS in England, you've really got to be able to navigate your way through and work out, well, obviously the regulatory activity is paramount. You need to make sure that you are compliant with all the regulations, but then there's all this best practice, standards, service guidelines coming at you. So it's a very, very complicated picture. Next slide, please. So, very, very busy, 127 organisations, but I think it's important that we then look into the functions of these particular bodies. So, hopefully this next slide will start to help us look at this. If you kind of look at all those regulatory and influencing bodies, if you group them, there's about 15 overseeing functions. So, a lot of them are involved in terms of registration. So quite clearly, a lot of that's about the professional bodies, but then you've got accreditation, policy as well, setting formal rules and guidelines. Some are involved in the monitoring of services and professionals. Interestingly enough, again, some will do investigations and inspections. Some have the power through the Act, and then within the regulations that come afterwards, they've got powers, so they can actually impose sanctions. So these might be penalties or fines. So CQC is a really good example. CQC increasingly now are taking organisations to court for failure to actually comply with a number of the regulated activities. Some of them have a role in analysing and sharing data, and that's about really trying to give, the NHS, but also, let's not forget the government as well, figures so they can see actually how the organisation is performing. So a lot of that is, yes, it's about regulatory activity, but some of that might be outcome data as well. Some do have a role in advice and support for the public. And again, also advice and support for healthcare providers and other regulators. Quite a few of the organisations have representation for professional groups, and then there's professional development and research. So there's an awful lot of activity in terms of functionality going on with these bodies. Perhaps another way to look at this, we can move on to the next slide, is this particular thing where you can see it's the things that we talked about there, and those 15 activities are sitting at the top. And as you step through the service regulators and the professional groups, you can hopefully start to see who's doing what. And you'll see there's an awful lot of them doing research. That's quite an interesting thing from that slide. But yes, it's a busy slide, but I think it's quite a good slide in terms of just being able to see from the regulators what they're doing. And then if we group, again, the organisations with the regulatory sort of effect and influencing, you can also see what the particular organisations are doing. Now, as I say, it's an awful lot of research going on there. But for me, the bit that probably stands out the most is that standard setting. You'll see an awful lot have got a key role in setting standards. And again, from an NHS provider perspective, its key question is how do you understand what standards are applicable to you going forward, and where that sort of links in terms of regulatory activity, and also in terms of the actual acts that are being passed by the government in either creating new or changing existing laws. So next slide, please. It would be remiss of me on a session talking about regulation standards, not just to touch upon, and it is literally just touching upon constitutional standards. A lot of people that work in the English NHS might have heard of them, but perhaps don't really understand what their link is into sort of what we do on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's quite useful just to unpick this for a few minutes. So next slide, please. So you can see here that it's some useful background information. The NHS Constitution in England, it's really aiming there to safeguard the principles really of the NHS, and it's trying to empower public, patients and staff, and it corrals, when it was published in 2012, what their existing legal rights and pledges were. So it kind of pulls it together, and it was, the thing was to put it into clear, simple language and set out the expectations for staff and patients, and actually what everyone was needing to do in terms of supporting the NHS. So it's quite an important document, and often, as I say, laid out in law and linked to an act, that people understand what these constitutional standards are. Because as we can see, 2012, and then they were updated in 15, and they keep being revisited. But generally, this is about what people can expect from the NHS in the country where they live. Next slide, please. So, number of rights and pledges contained in this, and if you look there at those bullet points, it's about access to the services, it's about the quality and care, and the environment that they're going to receive the care in. It's about how the NHS has nationally approved treatments and drug programmes. So then some important things really about what the public can expect in terms of respect, consent and confidentiality, about what choice they will have about the treatment, their involvement in their healthcare and the NHS, and processes in terms of if there are any complaints and redress. So yes, there's quite a lot embedded within the constitutional standards. So it is, as I say, it's very, very detailed across rights and pledges. So I'm just going to give you some examples so you can see what it actually looks like when you get into this. So next slide, please.
Oh, Howard, just quickly, somebody has asked, I'm intrigued to know what the role of Royal Colleges is within registration and investigations. My experience is they appear to support their members and uphold their requirements rather than those of the public.
Yes, I would take that as why I could see people would think that, because yes, it is, if you think it's a professional organisation. But yes, sometimes it can be involved in doing investigations. Sometimes they've been brought in as well to consider an investigation by the trust. So it's not like the CQC that following an incident that they would come in and be totally impartial. Normally, the Royal Colleges are brought in to carry out an investigation, or sometimes it might be that you can contact the Royal College and they will direct you to some people who may well be able to do and support an investigation. If under their particular, if you want, umbrella, but not necessarily as part of their organisation, if that makes sense. So yeah, I do take that point, yeah, and but they do have that function, and most if you're wanting investigations done and you're looking perhaps for people who have got the required specialist knowledge, you can contact the Royal Colleges. Sometimes they might say, yes, we can do that. A lot of the time they will direct you, because they sometimes, if you sound that, but they will have an approved group or panel of people who will who kind of they will use within their own sort of informal framework to carry out these things. So I know that might not answer your question, and I'm not being political with that answer, but yes, that's how an awful lot of colleges might be able to do that. But when they come in, they're normally doing that because they've been invited in. But you've also got to remember that the Royal Colleges do come in and inspect organisations to make sure that they meet standards which they would expect for training to take place within particular trusts and things like that. So they can be quite independent in relation to the standards that they require trusts to be meeting, perhaps in terms of the training environment, perhaps for I don't know, surgeons or physicians or something like that. Right.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, I'll move back. So the other thing, just to pick out here, you've got, and I know I'm talking about providers, but by far, as I said, the vast majority of what goes on within the NHS in terms of activity is provider related. So providers registered with the CQC must, if you want to comply with the fundamental standards, and again, there's a reference there to the Health and Social Care Act. So there's an act that's got there, and then you've got the regulations which are linked to that act, which if you want, that's how that they come to life. So these standards apply to all, if you want, registered persons and organisations. So that will include, for example, NHS bodies and local authorities if they're providing NHS funded care. So next slide. So fundamental standards, we've got those there. And essentially, when you look at them, this is the sort of the care and treatment, and that's the line by which it must never fall. So it's as a minimum, this is what we should be providing across the NHS. So they're there to try and hopefully move the NHS to like an outcome focus and around the quality and safety. And definitely, I cannot stress this enough. It's legal requirement that NHS hospitals, foundation trusts, practices, ambulance services, and everyone else that they're meeting these standards. So again, if you can get into your mindset that, as I say, when we're talking about constitutional standards and then the fundamental standards, this is by law, organisations must be meeting these. And I think sometimes people that work within trusts don't understand this is a legal requirement for us to meet these things. So, and I know a lot of the time, just due to what it's like working and like providing services within the NHS, and dealing with increasing demand and increasing acuity a lot of the time with an aging population is very, very difficult. But just remember, they still are legal requirements and that we need to be meeting these fundamental standards. Next slide, please. So we've got these standards, people register with the CQC, and essentially the CQC's, it's not its only role, but it is to make sure that providers meet these requirements. And as I say, the CQC flex their power accordingly, and as I said, people can be prosecuted for this. But there's a whole range of things that they can do, and so some of you that might well have read CQC reports, you'll see that you've got CQC will have, they'll do a report, and sometimes it's really good news for the organisation, other times less so, and it might well be there's a number of must do and should do recommendations which organisations then really need to sort of drop into an improvement plan and do that. And CQC will meet regularly, at least monthly, but sometimes we'll do follow-up visits as well to make sure that organisations moving in the right direction. And there's a variety of interventions that they can take before they get to prosecution. But yeah, so CQC is very much there. So back to constitutional standards. So I mentioned some of the rights. Just here, just one example. So as I said, that there are lots of other examples there, and this is about access to services. So I won't read the full lot there, but you can see that this is talking about you have access to certain services, and it's about waiting time. So 2 examples there. You've got the right to start a consultant-led treatment within a maximum of 18 weeks and referral to non-urgent conditions. And the other one is relating to obviously cancer, and that's with it's a 2-week wait there from GP to urgent referrals with cancer suspected. So that's written in law. It's interesting, obviously, if you're looking at things like 18 weeks and referral to non-urgent conditions, some of that has been impacted a little bit in relation to COVID-19 and the pandemic and the management of it. So, but this is, as again, very much, it's in law, it's in the constitutional standards. Next slide, please. That's just 2, but there's a number of pledges, and I'm not going through all of these, but it's just to give you a taste of these are the things when we talk about standards that need to be met within the NHS. So a lot of these things appear regularly in organisational performance reports, and there'll be lots of discussions that go on within the NHS where there's sort of like weekly and monthly discussions about how we're getting on with sort of urgent referrals for suspected cancer, or actually 4-hour waits in accident emergency departments. So there's a whole range of things which get reported on, and one of the reasons, as I say, why hospitals are very much held to account about their performance in relation to a lot of these waiting time standards is because it's backed up by law, and so there's an awful lot of those regulators who are very, very keen on looking at this information. And obviously NHS England and NHS Improvement, who are 2 big national organisations, use a lot of this information to see how well the NHS is managing really with a lot of demand. So next slide, please. This is sort of the final slide for me, really. It's about, well, final but one, where to go to find out which acts and standards apply. Missing a D on funds there, but never mind. So you've got 2 particular things. If you go to the CQC website and type in regulation for service providers and managers, or regulation for service providers and managers and relevant legislation, you will see that you can go there, and it's really good because they will actually have all the relevant acts, the regulations in terms of, it's probably better if you go to the next slide, it's probably a bit easier for me to explain. So there's a little screenshot there for you. So you can see there's the related legislation all the way through, so you can see that. And then there's a read across there to whether or not it's a registration regulation. As you can see, HSCA is Health and Social Care Act, And so it'll do that and it picks up. So you can actually then start to work through from your organisational perspective what regulations and what act it relates to, and you can step through each of those. So thank you for bearing with me. It's been a very quick trot through, if you want, the regulatory and standards landscape, and hopefully it's been of some use. I'll hand over to Rich now. We'll talk about perhaps if anyone's got any follow-up questions or access to slides. So thank you for bearing with me, everyone. Hope you found it useful, and perhaps see you again sometime.
Thanks, Howard. That was really, really brilliant. By the way, I was in charge of the slides, which was he kept saying next slide, and it was me who was randomly sometimes in the wrong area. I'm sorry about that. So just to we're getting some really good feedback actually, saying it was really useful. So has anyone got any questions? If you write them in the chat or the Q&A, and I believe that actually somebody responded to the original question about the Royal Colleges as well, saying having worked at Royal College of Physicians for many years, as Howard said, the Royal Colleges are a valuable ally in ensuring that patient safety regulations of practice are met, often provide the voice of reason against the hospital practices and administrative targets. They are critical friends. Yeah, because I think working in a hospital, you can get a bit subsumed with a lot of targets and things, and actually it might not actually be the best process for clinicians or patients to go through. So yeah, that sounds really helpful. Did that answer the person's question? Did that answer your question, Carl? Oh, here we've had another question. How would you prepare services for a CQC inspection to ensure they are meeting the KLOE?
Key line of inquiries, yeah, Chloe's, yeah. Look, the simple way for this is often there's an awful lot of ununderstandable preparation for inspections. It's very easy for me to say this, and I say as someone who's actually led hospitals' inspection preparations for CQC. The more you can build in your, if you want, self-assessment going forward against the key lines of inquiry, and there's audit and inspection. Sometimes that can be, if you want, like built in. I know that some organisations do a system called ward accreditation, which takes an awful lot of the key lines of accreditation, and they basically do this on a sort of regular basis. They'll do these inspections across all of their wards, units, teams, departments. And they've got this self-assessment, and they've got very much a clear picture of how compliant or not compliant they are in certain areas in relation to this. It's a much better, and I'm not saying you have to have ward accreditation, it could be any other form of perhaps doing, if you want, mock inspections, or we tend to call them quality inspections, so it don't look like it's all preparation for a CQC inspection, but you do some sort of quality checking and assessment against how compliant you are for each of your particular areas, and you build that in so that's there. Because the other alternative is you just hope for the best and see how you do when the CQC turn up, which I know might sound laughable, but some organisations have done that in the past, and they don't really know how compliant they are, and they're the ones that tend not to do too well out of the process. So for me, it's just building this self-assessment, reporting against compliance as business as usual activity. Now, I'm not saying magically that will make everything better, but at least you will have a picture about areas of non-compliance, and you might be able to focus some improvement activity in those areas.
Somebody else said, oh, great presentation and really comprehensive. Can you remind us of the role of the BMA? Because I suspect this is often misunderstood.
I think from my point is, again, BMA, you've got to remember, is professional association. And for me, it's very much, it's kind of the role that the BMA overtake. Again, it's if you think about that slide that I put up with all the things that they would get involved in, it's very much, they're sort of putting out best practice guidance there. It's obviously they have a role in terms of supporting their members in terms of the association. But I've always found in terms of the BMA guidance, it's often very easy, it's understandable. They've got to navigate as well through a political sphere as well in terms of representing what's best for them. But I think they do that in a way which they point out where we've got some of the big challenges within the NHS. And I suppose from my perspective, it's they're a very powerful organisation, and they do play quite a big role. I'm just thinking about what I've been talking about in terms of the regulatory field, in influencing the regulatory standards, and certainly they are always consulted on terms of standards and best practice. I don't know if that answers the question.
I'll wait to let you know if they say in the chat. Another person has asked, good morning, I have a question. This is Carla. How does the NHS regulate the quality for extra services like physiotherapy? As I see, the CQC reports don't include physiotherapy departments. Is there anybody doing it?
What I would say is that it's one of those things. Yes, physiotherapy input is looked at. So, for instance, one of the things that you might not realise is someone like CQC have got a whole team of analysts. So so before they arrive on site, but they've got to look at any service, they'll probably know like what the skill mix is like. They'll have asked for all this information, so they'll know things like how you stand up in terms of physiotherapists, if you want per beds and all that sort of thing. And I speak from someone who's done this in the past, so you kind of know in terms of what the therapy numbers should be for a particular area or unit. And so they will know that. They will look at what support is available for people on those units. And that will be all therapy, but I take your point in terms of physio. So the way they normally look at physios was they'll go onto a unit or ward and they'll look at what support. They'll sort of do it from a care pathway point of view. So they'll look at, right, so if you're in somewhere like, I don't know, care of the elderly, or if you're in a surgical ward or something like that, they will look at that. And one, I can guarantee you, they will be reviewing physio activity. They will be looking at how the physiotherapy team are dealing with patients. So they'll be looking at all sorts of stuff about caring, respect, it may be responsive. They will pick up, certainly if people are saying on the unit it's very difficult to get physio support, or it's really good, we're getting a really good physio, that's how they will pick up. So they won't go for that particular, if you want that particular profession or discipline. What they will look at is collectively what people on that unit are getting access to. So obviously, if there are issues and a number of people say, oh, it's terrible, we can't get, there's not enough physio, they will look into it a little bit more in a little bit more detail. But so I suppose the good news is, if you've had not too much interest in from your personal experience, and I'll use the CQC, but the CQC looking into that, that's probably because it's not been raised as a big or as big an issue, perhaps when CQC have come in and looked at the services. But they do look at all the therapy supports going into individual units, just as part of that inspection process.
Excellent. Oh, Carla said thank you very much. So that answered that one. And we also, I think the other person, is it Nayan? They thanked you for your response on that. Yeah, because I think a lot of the pathways are getting changed now, particularly musculoskeletal, can't even say it, are getting changed, where they actually include physio. To start that pathway, you have to have physiotherapy, and then you move forward, maybe potentially to surgery. So yeah, you would hope that during some of those transformation processes, they would look at the quality of those services. So anyone else got any questions? If not, we will be wrapping up. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. Make sure you are following us on LinkedIn and Twitter with @AsiaMelius. We will be sending out all of the slides from today to the email that you joined the call with. So look out for that. And we also have a YouTube channel where we have created lots of really helpful, insightful videos with lots of informative things around governance. So if you want to follow us on YouTube, that is the Healthcare Huddle. We'll put a link, as I say, in the email that we'll be sending out later. Is there anything else I haven't covered, Darren? No,
all that's left for me to say is thank you, Howard, and thank you, Rachel, for your presentations and your hosting today. Apologies, I couldn't be more involved. I've got a bit of a cough, which is very irritating, particularly if I start coughing over everybody. So
it's not COVID.
It's not COVID. No, just a bit of a chest infection. Anyway, have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll let you know when our next webinar is going to be and what the subject will be.
And if you, as you're logging out, if you have any suggestions for us on on what you would like us to cover in any future webinars, just leave them in the chat. We'll also be sending out a questionnaire after the webinar about how you felt it went, and if you could give us feedback, that'd be amazing because we'd love to improve. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.